Hi all, let's have a look at the mega clash of the Tata Steel Masters, long-awaited clash. Alireza Firouzja, who has been leading the tournament, against Magnus Carlsen, who had his first win just in round 8, and now against this powerful youngster who's rocking the chess world at the moment. Let's see what happened in this game. So Alireza chose e4, no surprise really there. We have e5, knight f3, e6, the classic Roy Lopez, knight f6, the Berlin defense, d3. This keeps more of the tension going. For example, on the old mainline move, the queens come off and it's a bit dull, and Magnus Carlsen has great experience in this position. It's thought to be very, very solid. Thanks to Vladimir Kramnik, this variation is all the rage and puts off people even playing 1e4. So the dreaded Berlin endgame here. The king's displaced, okay, but the queen's off and black has that bishop pair. So overall, this is quite interesting to play with black without too much fear. So we have d3 trying to keep the tension. So a fighting move, you could argue. d6, c3, a6. In this position, which has occurred before, for example, Topalov against Naidish in Kiev 2013, there was bishop e7. That was an interesting game. Topalov managed to win this position with white. I'll just quickly go through that just to show that white had a pretty solid position all the way through, played for c4, played for d5. But you'll notice that there's quite a good grip on this diagonal. For white, quite solid, and contests that diagonal with that bishop d3. So white has a solid grip. Black hasn't got that bishop pair here, just to contrast potentially to this game. So white's solid all the time. Very nice solid grip over there on the queen side. It's like a rock on the queen side, and plays on the king side as well. So a very, very nice game from Topalov. Very, very solid. So just think about this game when you look at the current game. Yeah, so that was it there. After knight d2, that knight is stranded. So yeah, black resigned there. Topalov against Naidish is a key stem game. So that's bishop e7. But Magnus chose a6. So will white be as solid in this game? We have bishop a4, bishop e7. Both sides castle. Rook e1, rook e8. Knight bd2, bishop f8. h3, b5, the bishop drops back all the way to c2, bishop b7, d4, g6. So this bishop is potentially going to be on g7, or maybe is it going to be this diagonal? There's two key interesting diagonals for both bishops in theory. The classic fianchetto offers this diagonal, and this one's on that fianchetto diagonal, but sometimes maybe the bishop later is going to be on this one, and maybe later this one. These bishops, there's the alternate fianchetto diagonals, which are less rarely used, but watch out for them in this game. These bishops are really interesting in this game, I've noticed, so watch out for that. a3, an interesting move. Does it actually go well with d5 though, this move? That's a big question here. We have knight b8 and d5 being played. Perhaps with a3 putting the brakes on b4, perhaps knight b3 is more solid. For example, ed, bishop g5 is a nuisance pin, and it's quite dangerous. For example, this position, white's doing fine. Yeah, there's some dangers lurking here in the position. So, yeah, knight b3. If c5, then maybe white can take on e5 and just be a bit boring and get a small edge, for example, like this, or even a potentially significant edge. So it's an interesting choice to play this d5 here. It's not strictly necessary. I've always thought that generally there's a little bit of controversy around d5. This c5 square, for example, is weakened. Now at the moment, the status of these bishops, they're not kind of that active. So it's interesting how Magnus can potentially activate these. That's something to look out for. And in particular, he does an immediate undermining move. With this a3, there's less piece development. The pieces are not gripping key squares that well right now. And Magnus chooses a very quick undermine with c6 of this pawn chain. And we have it being supported, but it looks like in not such a convincing way. We have knight bd7, which heads for that c5 square, which is quite tempting. If b takes c4, maybe then this kind of position is going to be quite solid for white. There's nothing really to fear here. It looks pretty solid. White has a small edge. So Magnus keeps things, keeps options open. Knight bd7. We have a4. So this is very, very interesting now. Knight f1 is just losing that c4. This is not a convincing gambit. So if the sensible b3 though, this might be pretty solid for white without too much to fear with this undermining. But a5 would be interesting here for this bishop to go to this diagonal. And it seems as though white's slightly awkward even in this position, even if it's technically equal. It seems this bishop might not be as great as this bishop potentially when it comes on this diagonal. So it's interesting, this contrast of the bishops. This is actually, even though this diagonal is out of the question, it's difficult to undermine any further, this bishop might actually be interesting on that diagonal. But anyway, a4 was played, queen c7, b3. Here, if a takes, let's try a forcing sequence. A takes, rook takes, bishop takes, b3, rook c8. This scenario is actually quite nice for black, but it is a bit blocked up. This bishop will never have a really nice diagonal there. So b3 looks like a solid choice as well. So okay, so b3, rook ec8, rook a2, and now we have b takes c4, b takes, and now a5. So it does give the idea that is this bishop going to be quite active on this diagonal later. Knight f1, bishop a6, knight e3. Here there are various choices. If bishop d3, that looks really quite passive. Knight c5, for example, snapping off the bishop, and this gives black, that nice bishop pair, nice c5 square. It's really quite nice for black here. If we carried this on, say d takes, this is just really very, very nice for black with an advantage. So knight e3, knight c5, knight d2, c takes. Now here, c takes was played. If knight takes, then maybe queen d8, and this position black should be fine. That c5 square is really quite delicious for black in these variations, giving black at least equality. So c takes d5. We have rook b8, bishop a3. There is a potential after this rook b8. It's not just looking pretty. Potentially, rook b8 is annoying, hitting e4 and putting pressure on a4. So bishop a3 keeps the rook out of b4. Queen d8. You'll notice though that this diagonal has been subtly weakened, and that's the amazing thing I felt about this game. After having played through it a few times, I felt, hold on a sec, these bishops are actually really potentially quite dangerous, it seems, in this central position. So the centre locked like this. So generally the bishops can't use the classic diagonals, but they can use these other two alternate diagonals. That's the striking impression I started to get here. So queen f3, and in fact this diagonal is kind of cherished with this move h5 to give the bishop a secure post on h6, shielded from frontal attack. So the bishop can later potentially go to h6, as it does actually now. So very, very nice, I thought, aesthetically, this bishop pressure on the white position. Of course, uncomfortable for white, not so comfortable. And the persistent pressure on the centre with this knight on c5. If that bishop ever left, then there's rook b4. So, there's a lot of piece pressure on the white position. Rook ab1. This queen, though, is kind of looking after two key squares in the position. We have a rook exchange, and now king g7, which relieves the queen from protecting f6, but the queen also has to protect b6. because it might be tempting at some point to hit this pawn. This pawn is a bit of a target, actually. Yeah, you can imagine if the queen could hit the pawn, but it would be neglecting the b6 square. So, in fact, yeah, if queen d7, queen takes f6, so that is sorted out first, protecting f6. But we see now knight f1. Maybe there's knight g3 and some stuff going on. That's ruled out. h4. Any knight g3 is ruled out. But it also means that now this bishop is also potentially given f4. And unless white plays g3, which would end up taking a pawn away from the centre and weakening the centre a bit more, this is starting to be an uncomfortable dark square entrenchment on both sides of the board. Very positional. This nice knight on c5, and now this piece is joining in on dark squares, potentially with f4 being used. If instead of h4, queen d7, that does weaken for a moment b6, which can actually be pounced on. So even though it might be tempting to go for that pawn, this is just really annoying. The queen might have to go back, and then it ruins everything. White's got a dynamic play here and should be fine. It should be about even. So black has to be really careful here with this rook b6. So h4 just carries on the dark square campaign on this side of the board. We have knight e3, and now the bishop does entrench itself. So these pieces also make a striking impression, entrenched on the dark squares. You know, difficult to sort of parry, putting pressure. White does appear plan this without too much counterplay with this move. It's a kind of admission that there's not much to do. So how does Magnus intensify the pressure here? His first move here is queen c7. So this still keeps an eye over the b6 square, still nannying b6 for the moment. And now white gets a little bit impatient already. Doesn't have to wait years and years for more weaknesses. g3 is played. This is a big commitment in the position. But if we look at this, instead of this pawn move, pawns don't go backwards. If rook b2, maybe black intensifies the pressure with a nifty move like queen a7. That's going to be pinning a key pawn. As we saw from the previous round, pinning a pawn is actually important. And for example, black could magnify the pressure, for example, like this, with you know, things falling apart like that. Or if we look at this variation again, say rook e1, again this diagonal is dangerous, and knight d3 for example is nasty, and you can see that this diagonal on f2 can become significant, for example like this, and horrible things could happen like this. Check, discovered check, winning the queen. So there's interesting ways to build up the pressure here. This g3 doesn't want to wait that patiently for things like that on brewing up on the diagonal. But it does seem possible that could happen. Hg, Fg, and now the bishop drops back. But damage has been done here to the centre. The pieces feel a bit looser. This bishop feels even more dangerous now on this diagonal. I just felt it was remarkable these bishops have such active diagonals coming out the Royal Pairs. If you look at the counterparts of both bishops, these are kind of miserable compared to their black counterparts here. So h4, queen d7, finally here looking to win a4. It also looks to play queen h3 as well, potentially. That's potentially dangerous with knight g4. So queen h3, it's like a double attack move in a way. It feels like a double attack move, but white did react to, you know, the possibility of ruling out queen h3 here. But now knight takes a4, snapping off that pawn. So yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, white didn't want to allow queen h3 and just loses that pawn. It feels like white's crumbling here. This is potentially a very strong outside pass pawn. But it's been given up for d6. So what's the point here? Because it doesn't d6 weaken e5. So white did take on d6. If we, for a moment here, have a look at rook b6, this is too slow by a long shot after bishop takes f1. Say knight takes, there's rook c2 check, and this is a disaster. This 7th rank rook is an absolute disaster after queen d7 check, for example. Bishop f4 threatens all sorts of things. for example, knight g3, knight takes g4 is a crushing tactic, with rook h2 check winning the queen. Yeah, if we look at this position with rook b6, yeah, it's not a very good alternative to the game. If king g1 here, then queen d4 check picks up the rook as well. And if king h1, then just knight takes e4 defends d6 securely, and there's all sorts of things like rook f2 as well on cards here. So yeah, the bishop takes d6 seems absolutely necessary without any messing around. Okay. So now a key move for Magnus Carlsen. Can you guess what Magnus plays in this position? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. It looks as though, hold on a sec, isn't this looks a bit loose now, doesn't it? But look at black's magnificent bishops here. So what does Magnus do? Okay, the queen comes to d4. This puts pressure on d2, that magnificent bishop there. And if that moves, then e4 would drop. It protects e5. It's a really powerful move, central move, all of a sudden. We have queen f2. It's like, you know, this pincer from Magnus with these bishops, like a crab. Very, very fierce bishops here for black. So queen f2. If knight b3 as an alternative, then rook c2 check and queen d3. This is really dangerous. The centre's crumbling, and black could pick up material like that, for example. So queen f2. But now it just collapses. Queen takes f2 and bishop takes f1. And the game abruptly ended here, just before move 40. Incredible, the collapse. So with the cashing out of this particular bishop, that bishop on that diagonal. If king takes f1, then bishop takes d2, so that's out of the question. If knight takes f1, then knight takes e4 check, and then knight takes d6. So, okay. And if we continue just for a moment, though, just to test something further, because there's a nasty pin after bishop takes e5 here, you might think, hold on a sec, this isn't the end of the story there, because maybe there's rook b6, maybe there's d6. Black here can parry the threats. Can you see what black would do to sort of the most incisive move? Can you guess? It seems bishop c3 is the most incisive, even if it has a self-pin implication. So, for example, rook c1, we just take this, and the two minor pieces should overwhelm the rook. So this should be overwhelming the two minor pieces here, and the centre is going to collapse there, and there's no time for rook d2. There's always a check. So this should be a big advantage for black. So this variation, there's nothing much to do. Less accurate here, just for the record, rook e8 keeps that pin. White can keep the pin, and actually it could get a little bit tricky after d6. Yeah, this might actually get really tricky, for example here. So, you know, there's still accuracy needed even in the final position. Black might have a small edge, but it's tricky compared to that bishop c3 move. That would be the most incisive. Also, a4 reserves the right, even if this happens for bishop c3, even here, though. That's to be noted as well. So, anyway, I'll take you back to the game end. So, overall, the striking impression that I got from this game, which I found kind of interesting, because I'm not usually motivated to play, you know, very solid Roy Lopez with black, because I feel the pieces are kind of cramped sometimes, especially this bishop. But Magnus showed that this bishop was really great on this diagonal, and the light square bishop found a great diagonal. So it seems as even if the centre's locked in, the bishops have alternate kind of fianchettoed diagonals, it seems, that they can play with, as was really well demonstrated by this game. And as soon as they were cashing out, the bishop was being used, that was, you know, causing White's resignation. The centre was basically collapsing. So fascinating stuff, fascinating positional game, which I'm sure will be used in middle game books for years to come. So, yeah, well done for Magnus for defending his honour as world champion, and for the moment, Alireza Firouzja put in check, so to speak. Otherwise, he's really dominating this tournament. Absolutely, it's been a fantastic performance, nevertheless, even with this game. Really one to watch in the chess world, and I'll definitely be covering a lot more of his games. Apparently, he had in his youth been looking at some of my Blitz games. Apparently, the rumor I heard on Twitch. Yeah, and some videos to support that. So I'm really honoured that such a great player would have been influenced by even some of my casual stuff on YouTube in the last few years. So this is a really great up and coming player who may one day be world chess champion. You never know. Okay, thanks very much.